record. All right, so this week we are going back in time. I put some links on the website just yesterday. Sorry, I didn't do it sooner, forgot. Including the joke book that Debbie mentioned last week in case you wanted to purchase. But I want to look specifically at these 3 text sheets, Sepharia sources that I linked to. So the first one, where do I want to start? That one's definitely Talmud. Okay, so let's start with the first one. Share screen. There we go. So to some degree, we're extrapolating out a lot, or we're guessing on the intentions of some of this. But the first instance of laughter in the Bible is this story of the angels telling Abraham that he will be a father in his own old age, that Sarah will bear him a child specifically in her old age. And they both laugh. Their sentences are pretty similar, but their treatments are not. There's this sense of they're both incredulous, they're both, yeah, I guess incredulous, but that Abraham is more willing to believe it. That there's this sense of like, Abraham's tickled by the idea and thinks it's like far-fetched, but he's like, yeah, all right, God does miracles. Whereas Sarah is a little bit more bitter about it, and that she doesn't believe that she could be pregnant. And some of this is very much in like the midrashic understanding. As you can see in these 2 sentences, it's not very clear in the text itself that that's what's happening, but that's how they are read. So then Jeremy Dauber comes along and suggests that this is sort of the base of the misconception that like women aren't funny, women don't have senses of humor, that like Sarah laughs at something that's not actually a joke, and she's and God like rebukes her for it, right? Like they both laugh, but God only scolds Sarah for not believing that she could get pregnant in her old age. And so there's our starting point, right? Of humor in the Bible is this concept of misunderstanding what's a joke, and that there's already sort of some sexism baked in here to Jewish comedy.
Does it say somewhere that where God is upset with Sarah?
Yeah, let's look at the text itself. So yeah, so the 17, where was it?
Oh, I think I saw it.
Yeah, that Abraham. Okay, so that's earlier up. And then down here, Abraham laughed, and the Lord said, why did Sarah laugh?
Yeah.
And yeah, he like scolds her for it.
And I don't think I've seen this translation before, because I never noticed it before. What Sarah says, if you go up another line, it's almost a double entendre. I mean, she doesn't say, how can I have a child? She says, how can I have enjoyment? And it's almost
Mm,
a reference to sexual pleasure possibly, which is also humorous, that double entendres are part of a good comedian's repertoire. So
yes, that's true. Yeah. Edona. I guess that is what was the translation over here?
it was the
Shall I
same.
have my pleasure? Yeah. Okay.
I never noticed that before.
It's a good catch, Debbie. So yeah, so there's he brings up this verse a few times through the book. One in this when he talks about Jewish comedians and this base of sexism that is pervasive through comedy, not just Jewish comedy, but in a lot. And partly because, written material as a whole was for so long a man's domain. The public discourse was a man's domain. And so that meant comedy that got publicized at least was men's comedy, and often it would be about women. Their wives, their mothers, whatever could be the butt of the joke, but the women's voices didn't actually get heard. So he brings it up there. Jeremy Dauber brings it up there, and he talks about one of the unkosher comedians says, or she's asked, what's the difference between a male comic and a female comic? And she says $1,000 a night, or $1,000 a weekend. So but he also brings it up too in the body humor section, that a lot of humor is about anxieties, especially of functional bodies. So that's the joke here too, that Sarah, and especially as you pointed out, Debbie, that we didn't really catch before, shall I have my pleasure, that this concept of whether or not their bodies still work, there's a joke about male potency here. So Rav Hirsch Drash is on this, that Rav Hirsch's take then is a little bit more of the relief theory view of comedy, that it's not really that it's funny or that there's a joke here, but that Sarah laughs because what else could you do at this information, and then we see moving on into Exodus, there's a great amount of sarcasm in Jewish humor. I had a Talmud teacher, I think I mentioned this last week, that said the Talmud, sarcasm is invented in the Torah, or sorry, in the Talmud, because the rabbis are so sarcastic with each other. But in preparing for this week's lesson this right now, I found a lot of sarcasm in the Torah or in the Bible itself. So we've got this here. There were no graves in Egypt. You had to take us to die in the wilderness. You can just hear it. There's a part of it that's just, on the surface, the whining of the Israelites, and they're so ungrateful and all of that. But there's also clearly there's this humorous irony that they are jabbing at Moses. They have to be self-aware enough to know that this is funny. And then next, this verse comes up a lot when looking through sources of Jewish comedy or whatever. This verse of Elijah in 1 Kings it's in the scene where he's challenging Jezebel, who has turned the Israelites. She's the queen, and she's completely like turned the Israelites away from God, and they're all praising Baal. And so Elijah challenges them. We'll have the two fire or the two like altars set up, and we'll pray to each our gods, and whichever one spontaneously catches fire, or the sacrifice burns up, we'll know that God is real. And just to like really show his good faith, he even has the priests of Baal douse his with water, with several buckets of water, and still his is the one that catches fire, and theirs remains untouched. And he teases them again with this sarcasm. Maybe your God is sleeping or on a journey. He has to cry louder, keep shouting. Yeah, it'll work. Keep going. So we see that there is this biting, like teasing humor is pretty key to Judaism, or to Jewish sensibilities from the beginning. And then I skipped a couple because they are rabbinic, and we're going to get to the rabbinics next, but I want to focus on Torah first. The Book of Esther. Now, we've talked about this before. We talk about it at Purim. We did it last year, I think, when we did the 5 Megillot. And I mentioned it again last week, that the whole book really is a comedy. It's a satire. It's a farce. It's meant to be taken as a joke. Like, a lot of it is about turning things upside down, subverting the norms, common practices of Purim throughout the ages have been to be in drag. Like, it's all about, I don't know if comedy is the right word. It's not necessarily a joke, but like, it's funny, it's silly, it's tongue-in-cheek. There's a lot of that. And so here's just like one part that I didn't create this source sheet, but I appreciated it. So this is just one part that they chose, that the king arose from his banquet and went into the palace garden. This is right after Esther has revealed that she's Jewish and Haman wants to kill all the Jews. Haman remained to make requests for his life to Queen Esther. To Esther the queen, for he saw that there was evil determined against him by the king. Then the king returned out of the palace garden into the place of the banquet of wine, and Haman had fallen upon the couch whereon Esther was. He said, the king said, "Will Haman even force the queen before me in my house?" As the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face, and then they hang Haman on his own gallows. So there's like, again, we've got the jokes about, male anxieties, that like the king is afraid Haman's ravaging his wife. There's like sort of the helplessness of Esther being a butt of a joke. There's the ironic jabs at our enemies, that he is hanged on his own gallows is sort of, a darkly funny, ironic twist of fate. And there's so much of this throughout the Book of Esther. No, just open the Book of Esther. I don't want all these slides. Okay. We've got like, so that's the ending. We've kind of jumped to the ending with that the ironic twist of fate that he is hung on his own gallows. Yeah, go ahead.
Is this sort of the beginning of the Jewish custom of laughing in the face of of adversity, of horrible things going on, but still, because the subject matter of the Book of Esther itself is not funny,
Correct.
but throughout history, we've done that, I guess.
Yeah. I would say, I don't know if it's the origin of it, because we see, like, isn't that kind of also what's happening in those verses from Esther, from Exodus and Elijah, from Kings, that like they're genuinely worried. Like, Elijah has been threatened by Jezebel with death, and this is his, like, his means of saving himself is proving that the words he brings from God are real and not just anti-Jezebel, right? Like, and so there's already from the beginning that I think, definitely. And then there's also the question with the Book of Esther, like, it's more directed at it's more harsh, it's more directed at our enemies in a way that, like, Elijah's taunting isn't quite as harsh. But the Jews of Persia were actually pretty safe, which is why this story is possible. Because if you imagine telling this story under a oppressive regime that does actually want to commit genocide against you, like, they're not going to like this story. So there is that question that comes up toward the end of Jeremy Dauber's book, and a little bit already in Telushkin's book, which I'm not very far into yet, but he touches on it right from the beginning, that there is a certain like wave of humor that comes with dealing with oppression, that, like, there is some amount of it that's necessary in the heart of it, but you have to be careful, and it's often coded and things like that because you're still in the thick of it. And if you don't laugh, then you give in to the misery of it all. But if you laugh too obviously, then your oppressors will come down even harder on you. So there's like that. And then you have that, like, relative safety once you've escaped the oppressive regime. But the trauma of it is still very new, where you are able to get things like the Book of Esther, or the producers, like Springtime for Hitler in Germany, Mel Brooks having very much come out of that generation of, he was not German, but he fought for the Americans in World War II and saw a lot of that up close. And as a Jew, clearly that affected him as well. So there's that response to it. And then once assimilation gets too good, you start to come back down, and we lose that, like, very Jewish edge to humor, which raises the question, like we talked about in book club a couple months ago, about the Jews of Kaifeng. Like, if there's no anti-Semitism and we assimilate completely, have we lost our Jewishness? Which is that's a tough one. We don't have to get too deep into that, but that question comes up again with the humor, with the styles of Jewish comedy that have historically been so much a response to trauma and oppression. So we don't have to get too much deep in the weeds with Esther. It's just I did want to look at it because it's so silly, like, just on the face of it. Even, I know the story gets very dark, and that's not silly on the face of it, but the opening scene is that the rules for drinking were, there are no rules. Like, that's so silly to put in the Bible, that's so absurd. And And then there's all these places for sexual innuendo, which maybe, again, like aren't necessarily jokes, but they are meant to elicit giggles. That like when King Ahasuerus wants Vashti to come out to dance wearing the royal diadem, and the implication there is that she will come out wearing only the diadem. And her refusal that sets off the whole story in motion is again this like joke at the king's manhood, right? That the message is conveyed by eunuchs, and that the king has been denied his like ownership of his wife's body, and that it's like so deeply damaging to his masculinity that he has to send her away or possibly even kill her. It's a little vague, because like, what if all the women in Shushan or even all the women in Persia realize that they have autonomy? This will be the end of civilization as we know it. Like, again, even the authors of this story being like probably, you know, men living in a patriarchal society of their own, they are exaggerating this out to extremes to just show like how ridiculous King Ahasuerus is. It's all about setting up these like straw man characters for the political farce of it all. And yeah, so the whole thing is like that. Does anybody have, I don't know, questions or comments about biblical humor before we go on to Talmudic?
And it's just, I mean, I've, you know, gone to Purim spiels for decades but always assumed that the humor was put on at a later, was added on to it at a later date. And last year was you emphasized the humor in it, that this whole thing was a farce. And it let me read it that way, having you. So it's interesting because it's possible to read it in so many different ways, but once you realize that the humor is there, you can find it.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's true of a lot of parody, right? But it can be a fine line. And we see this in modern day. We talked about this like just a little last week about the sort of meta anti-Semitism in some Jewish parody, that like you have to have a deep understanding of the thing you're parodying. Like it has to look real enough that all the tongue-in-cheek humor is actually funny, and it's not just silly. Like if it's silly without a foundation, then it's slapstick, which I mean could be funny in its own right too, but it's not the same kind of funny, you know? Like the difference between Scream 1 and Scary Movie. I know that those are like very generational for me, so I'm sorry if you've not seen them, but Scream 1 was supposed to be a parody in itself, or Cabin in the Woods is a more recent one, I don't know, that like it's actually got scary parts. It's a real homage to classic horror, but also it's over the top, and it's meant to be like a commentary on, you know, on sort of the silly tropes of teen horror movies. So many people didn't realize that necessarily, and it was just hailed as a good horror movie, that then the subsequent sequels tried too hard to take themselves seriously, and they lost the parody thread. And then they weren't as good as horror movies either. By contrast, then Scary Movie tried to go too far and be too obviously a horror movie or too obviously a parody movie that then they lost the horror thread. There's no element of tension or scariness to it. It's all goofy, slapstick, body humor, gross out humor. It's so over the top. So like there's that element to it of you have to know the thing that you're parodying. You have to like be in the mind. There has to be that element of seriousness to it to be good parody or satire. But then also if it's too subtle, then you run the risk of like just saying the thing that you're making fun of and then you lose the joke because people just believe the thing you're saying, like that's the thing with the meta anti-Semitism jokes, that if it's not clear that it's a joke, then you get people just parroting the anti-Semitism. So I think, and the trouble with Esther as an example of that is that it's so many centuries old and in a language we don't speak very well, if at all, that it's hard to see those layers. And we have to just rely on the scholars that tell us, no, these layers are there for sure. This is a very good intellectual political farce that in its time was very much a parody of other types of theater that were happening in the area, in the ancient Near East. And, and here are all the connections to like Esther is Ishtar and Mordecai is Marduk. And this is like not just a political farce on the like anxieties of living in exile and under a foreign government, but also a play on the forms of theater that were essentially worship for a lot of pagan cultures that they reenacted out the gods, what the gods were doing. And so there's like that parallel. And if you don't know all that history, then like it's kind of lost on us, right? So that's the trouble with really ancient humor, is that the cultural norms they're making fun of are so far past that we lose it a little bit. But once you know it's there, you can appreciate this long history of Jewish humor and of making fun of our oppressors and all of that. So there is that. So moving on then to Talmud. I kind of want to show this video, but we'll get to that because as long as we're talking about the Book of Esther, yeah, let's just do it. Okay, wait, hold on. I have to share sound. I didn't do that. I may have shown this to you before because you know how I love this show. This Israeli sketch.
אחשוורוש, איש יהודי היה בשושן הבירה ושמו מרדכי. ויהי אומן את אסתר בת דודו, והנערה יפת תואר וטובת מראה.
יש! אסתר! אסתר!
קראת לי, דודי?
אסתר!
כן.
מצאתי פתרון לבעיה שלנו. נכון שאחשוורוש רוצה להשמיד אותנו.
נכון.
ונכון שאחשוורוש לא כל כך מרוצה מבשתי בזמן האחרון.
נו.
אז ככה, את הולכת לארמון, עושה לאחשוורוש קצת חנדלח, קצת פוצי מוצי, והופ, אחשוורוש לא רוצה להשמיד אותנו.
אוקיי, אחלה רעיון, אבל זה לא נראה לך קצת בעייתי לשלוח אותי לאחשוורוש? זה קצת עושה אותי...
קצת מה?
זונה?
איך זונה?
כאילו, שלא תחשוב, זה רעיון טוב, אבל זה קצת מוציא אותי, אתה יודע, זונה.
איך זונה?
טוב, אולי לא הבנתי. אתה רוצה שאני אהיה עם אחשוורוש?
כן.
וקצת פוצי מוצי?
להציל את העם.
נו, אז זה כמו זונה.
לא, זה לא כמו זונה.
זה לא כמו זונה, זה זונה.
זה לא זונה.
זה כן זונה.
זה לא זונה.
זה כן זונה.
איך זה זונה?
איך זה לא זונה? אתה שולח אותי להיות עם גבר זר?
כן.
לך יוצא מזה משהו?
בוודאי, אני מציל את עצמי ממוות.
נו, אז זונה.
רגע אחד, אסתר.
זונה.
אסתר?
זונה.
אסתר, שנייה.
אתה רוצה שאני אהיה זונה?
לא זונה.
זה זונה.
אני יכול להגיד מילה?
המילה הזאת זה זונה?
לא.
אז לא.
אסתר, תביני טוב טוב, אם התוכנית שלנו תצליח, העם שלנו יכיר לך תודה, יכתבו עלייך שירים, יכניסו אותך לתנ"ך.
וואלה יופי, דוד המלך, ירמיהו הנביא ואסתר הזונה, אחלה.
לא זונה, מלכה.
מלכה של זונות.
לא זונה, תפו חס וחלילה זונה. את תהיי המושיעה של העם שלנו. הסיפור שלך יחיה לנצח, יהיה חג על שמך. חג של שמחה, וילדות קטנות יחכו כל השנה לחג הזה כדי להתחפש לאסתר.
אז הם התחפשו לזונות?
רק בתיכון.
Makes me laugh every time.
That was good.
So, that's one. Then we have this story about Purim, which again, on its face, doesn't have to be funny. Like you could just read it as a, I don't know, as a story of two friends that shouldn't be friends anymore. But there's like this tongue-in-cheek, like sarcasm to it that is, again, scholars tell us, is clearly meant to be a joke. So Rabbah and Rabbi Zera prepared a feast with each other, and they became intoxicated to the point that Rabbah arose and slaughtered Rabbi Zera. The next day, he became sober and realized what he had done. Rabbah asked God for mercy and revived Rabbi Zera. The next year, Rabbah said to Rabbi Zera, "Let the master come and let us prepare the Purim feast with each other." And Rabbi Zera said to Rabbah, "Miracles do not happen each and every hour, and I do not want to undergo that experience again." And so they did not have Purim again. So there's, you know, this custom on Purim of getting so drunk that you can't tell Mordechai from Haman. And even though that is within the Talmud itself, that's a rabbinic mitzvah, the rabbis also say, but like, maybe beware of how drunk you get or who you get drunk with. And there's just lots of little, you know, silliness. It's sort of like, I think, in the carnival traditions of like king for a day, but then sometimes there's a, I don't know, a double-edged sword to that of like, it's a, who gets picked to be king for the day could be someone who's so down on their luck that like, it's a little insulting or like it's a backhanded compliment kind of thing. And I think there's a little bit of that happening in this story of like, you know, be careful who you party with. Moving on from Purim, there is this verse, I don't know, this story from Ta'anit, which is a section of the Talmud about fasting. Two brothers came to the marketplace. Elijah said to Rabbi Baroka, "These two also have a share in the world to come." When Rabbi Baroka went over to the two men and said to them, "What is your occupation?" They said to him, "We are jesters and we cheer up the depressed. Alternatively, when we see two people who have a quarrel between them, we strive to make peace. It is said that for this behavior, one enjoys the profits of the actions in the world to come, and yet his reward is not, his actions in this world, and yet his reward is not diminished in the world to come." So cheering people up not only brings people joy in this world and makes you popular, it also earns you a place in the world to come. There are lots of places in the Talmud where Elijah coming is, or Elijah being invoked, is like simultaneously serious, but also humorous, that it's not necessarily a joke, but there's this, like, anytime not anytime, but often when a argument cannot be resolved and both sides have made very good claims for their positions, then the Talmud will say, we'll know when Elijah comes who was right. So there's this sense that it's very ancient to laugh. This is our last bit of text, and then we'll back up and talk more about patterns, I suppose. So this one's funny. This is the kind of stuff that's all over the Talmud, by the way, this story. Like, ostensibly, the purpose of it is like the logic puzzle of it, and how the legalistic ancient rabbis thought, and the kinds of things that not the kinds of things they cared about, but the minutia they were willing to get into to make a broader point. But some of that minutia gets so silly. So a certain man named Hanan the Wicked slapped another certain man, and he came before Rav Huna for judgment. Rav Huna said to him, "Go give him a half dinar. That is the fine imposed for such an act." Hanan the Wicked had a damaged whole dinar, and he wanted to give him a half dinar from it, but no one would take it from him to give him the smaller coins. No one would exchange his change for him. So instead, Hanan the Wicked just slapped the man again and gave him the whole dinar as payment. When in debt, just go all in, right? This one made me laugh. When Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi died, humility and fear of sin ceased. Rabbi Yosef said to the Tana who reviewed the Mishnah, "Do not teach that humility ceased, for there is still one who is very still humble, me." I liked that one also because that tradition continues. Maimonides in the Mishnah Torah, in one of the sections on law, he does teach that the only thing that you should have in abundance, everything should be in moderation except humility. That's the only thing you should have in abundance. Meanwhile, his introduction to the same set of law tells his readers that I've gone through the whole Talmud, I've distilled all the arguments, and here is the whole halacha. You don't ever have to read any other Jewish book. I've done it for you. You're welcome. So humility and abundance, I don't know.
And that's a running joke today also.
Yeah.
I just got a children's book out of the library so I could read on FaceTime with the kids, and it's about a duck and a bike, and the duck is riding a bike through the farmyard, and all the animals are thinking how silly he looks and how they would never be caught doing that, and they're way above riding a bike. And then a bunch of kids come and leave their bikes in the yard while they go in and get something to eat, and all the animals get on the bike and ride around the farmyard, even though they were way too good to do it. So still here.
That's a good one. Megillah, is this no? Abaye said, "When I left the house for the master Rabbah to go to Mare Bar Mar," which, by the way, like, sometimes names themselves. We see this more so in the Bible than in the Talmud, because for the most part, the names in the Talmud are the actual names, but like Mare Bar Mar means like Mr. son of Mr. it's communicating to us that this is a respected man from a respected lineage, but not a rabbi. So Abaye was already satiated when he left the house of Rabbah. However, when I arrived at Mare Bar Mar's house, they served me 60 plates of 60 kinds of cooked dishes, and I ate 60 portions from each of them. The last dish was called pot roast, and I was still so hungry that I wanted to chew the plate afterward. And in continuation, Abaye said, this explains the folk saying that people say, the poor man is hungry and does not know it, as Abaye was unaware of how hungry he had been at his master's house. Alternatively, there is another appropriate expression, room in the stomach for sweets can always be found. It's like the opposite of the saying your eyes are bigger than your stomach. Just silliness, eating. That one's not that funny. Let's keep going. Rabbi Dosa ben Harkanis says, late morning sleep, midday wine, chatter of children, and sitting in the assembly houses of the ignorant remove the person from the world. So there's a lot of that too in the rabbinic text, in the Talmud, and also in the like early medieval, responsa and philosophy books, that like humor is idle chatter, and it's not good. It takes time away from Torah. It is the antithesis of Torah, and all it can be very self-serious, but then the same rabbis turn around and like snark at each other and say things like, well, I didn't follow this law when it came to interacting with this other rabbi because he's kind of a schmo and I don't respect him, so I didn't need to follow the law in regards to him. And it's like, clearly that's funny. That's idle chatter. I'm sorry. So there's a lot of that. There was a saying in like Middle Ages Europe that Jews were particularly humorous. They're bookish, they're serious, they keep to themselves, like pre-Hasidic movement. That's not just Middle Ages, I guess, but like 14th through or 13th through 17th century, like this was the common belief. And like to us now, that's absurd because like Jewish comedy is American comedy in so many ways. But that comes from some of these sayings in the Talmud that are like, we don't laugh, don't talk to children. But then clearly the whole time they were cracking jokes at each other. Yeah. We already read that one on the other source sheet. Rav Yehuda said, and so too one should be joyful before stating a matter of Jewish law. Ravav said, and so too one should be joyful before going to sleep in order to have a good dream. The Gemara asks, is that so, that one should introduce matters of Jewish law joyfully? Didn't Rav Gidel say that Rav said, any Torah scholar who sits before his teacher and his lips are not dripping with myrrh due to fear of his teacher, those lips shall be burnt. As it says, his lips are as lilies dripping with and flowing myrrh. I'm not sure why that quote of Song of Songs communicates fear of his teacher, but anyway, he interpreted homiletically, do not read moreover, flowing myrrh, rather read mar over, flowing bitterness. Likewise, do not read shoshanim, lilies, rather read sheshanim, that are studying, meaning that the lips are studying Torah, must be filled with bitterness. The Gemara explains that is not difficult. There is no contradiction here. As this, where it was taught that one should introduce matters of Jewish law joyfully, is referring to a rabbi. And that, where it was taught that one must be filled with bitterness, is referring to a student who must listen to his teacher with trepidation. And if you wish, say that this, and that are referring to a rabbi, and so it is not difficult. This, where it was taught that he must be joyful, is when he's teaching, and he must be filled with bitterness when he is learning. Before he began teaching Jewish law to the sages, he would say something humorous, and the sages would be cheered. Ultimately, he sat in trepidation and began teaching the Jewish law. There's, on that note of the seriousness of respect for one's teachers, that a teacher can be funny, but a student must be very serious to soak it all in. There was, is it in here? No, one of the sheets I was looking at had a good example of this, where there's an important tradition in the Talmud of citing one's sources, which, I mean, they didn't have MLA citations then, but they would say so Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rava, blah, 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 and give the halacha. Usually it's just one, maybe two chains of communication. So-and-so said in the name of so-and-so. Maybe so-and-so said in the name of so-and-so who learned it from so-and-so. But there was one example in one of these humorous sheets. There's it's very serious business, but then again, it just they have to know that this is ridiculous. When there was a chain of 10 names before you actually got to the halacha. So-and-so said in the name of so-and-so, in the name of so-and-so, in the name of so-and-so, who learned it from so-and-so, who taught it to this, big Hillel, blah, blah, blah. And it was it was huge, this long list of names. They had to know that was silly. So those are our examples. Some of my favorites of Talmudic comedy also includes, let's see if I can find my notes on it. As I said, there is this one. They're arguing. Rav Bar Shaba, Ravina gives a halacha, and his classmates say, but that's not what you did to Rav Bar Shava. And he says, well, Rav Bar Shava is not important to me. So then in the same section of Talmud, Rav Beve poses a halacha, and Rabbi Zarika asks a question that he determines to be a dumb question. So Rav Beve just straight up kicks him. There's 3 times in that chapter of Talmud that Rav Beve is just kicking people. Wild West of the Beit Midrash, I'm telling you. That there's a lot of this. Oh, also a lot of the humor. We talked a little bit about types of Jewish humor last week, the body humor bit. There's a lot of that in the Talmud that, again, it's not clear on the surface of it that it's meant to be funny, but it's hard not to giggle at it, that the rabbis are talking about, there's a section, they're talking about the Eruv, the line that goes around Orthodox communities to mark a shared space. So, it says you can't go however many cubits from your home, but if you encircle that many cubits, around the whole neighborhood, then that counts. That's still your safe space, even if it's not your house specifically. So they're talking about Eruvim. And then there's the question of if you've gone X number of cubits away from your home. And then you realize you have to use the bathroom. And how many cubits is the nearest bathroom? And there's all these like loops around, and then they spend 3 pages talking about where you can go to the bathroom. Like, come on. So there's plenty of material going way back that are various types of funny, and some of it is not immediately obvious because we've lost the culture norms that they're making fun of, but you can see as we dive in some of that base. And then and so next week we'll move forward a little bit. We'll look at some medieval and Enlightenment humor, which gets very like intellectual, and there's still some body humor, but it's very based on knowing the scripture and writing parodies of scripture, which you would think is sacrilegious, but apparently they did it all the time in those medieval times. Yeah, and then we'll move forward from there. Last questions or comments?
Thank you. I'm very impressed with your scholarship and your
Thanks.
knowledge.
So some of the humor, I mean, it's funny to us reading and imagining these 2 rabbis especially going at each other, but some of it was meant almost to be mean, as opposed to, I mean, they were using a humorous way of humorous, there's a word and I can't think of it right now, to mean humor, what it would be. But that's interesting to read, and for guys that were supposed to be very
Very serious. Yeah.
Virtuous. Yes, virtuous.
Yeah. Yeah, I learned pretty early on in studying Talmud that you basically have to read all of the arguments in a like yeshivish sarcastic tone to understand, because partly because there's not good punctuation in the Aramaic, so it's hard to follow anyway, but there's so much of the argument that is just like, oh, you think that, but you're wrong. And so it doesn't necessarily give a clear refutation, but first it has to like take this sarcastic jab at the other rabbi and be like, oh, really? You think that the sky is green? Is that what you're saying? And like, that's not what the other rabbi said, but they just like, they set up these ridiculous arguments. And you have like, I learned early on, one of the things that made me pretty good at Talmud in my first semester, even though I'm not good at translating, like I had trouble with the mechanics of it, but understanding this style of logic, which a lot of people do struggle with because it's different than how we normally talk. But in my head, I used those voices, and it made it all a lot clearer how the conversation back and forth was happening. There's also a lot of that, like you saw in some of this, what text we just looked at, and we see it a lot in the Torah, where there's like, he said to him, and you lose the thread of who him is, like who's talking to who. So again, you got to use the voices, and then it all becomes very clear. So anyway, thanks guys. This was fun.
Thank you. Take care.
See you next week.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.